Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 14th chapter. Now, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks them for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Please be seated. His name is Philemon, and this guy has a problem. You know, a few years ago, I got to preach a kids' time about this second reading of Philemon on my former church. And after the service, a little girl came to me and said, "Pastor, I really liked your message." And we had a little conversation about it. And as we were talking, one of his parents came over to pick her up. And she, very excited, told her parents, Pastor Manuel shared a kids' time today, and it was great." The parent responded, "Really? What did Pastor talk about?" And the girl responded, "He talked about Pokemon." Well, Philemon was the one with the problem, not Pokemon. But you know, the problem that Philemon has is precisely that if we take Jesus seriously, we'll get to realize that Jesus wants us to change the world. And friends, that will not be an easy task. Let me give you a little background about this second reading that we heard from Philemon. Paul is writing from a prison around the year 60. He's preaching about Jesus. And we're told that he has a friend named Philemon. You know, Paul was probably the one who baptized Philemon. He was probably the first person who preached about Jesus to Philemon. So, you know, Philemon owes Paul his faith, probably even his soul, to Paul. Philemon was somebody that owned slaves at that time. It was a custom thing to do. And we're told that one of Philemon's slaves, called Onesimus, run away. You know, the Roman law was very clear that when a slave runs away from his master, anybody who saw that person had to call the authorities so they could arrest him, and then the rightful owner of the slave was entitled to have a severe punishment for that person. So, somehow Onesimus gets to Paul while he was in prison. And what did Paul do? Did he call the authorities to get him arrested? No. What Paul did was to preach to him. Paul baptized Onesimus. And then after doing that, he writes back to Philemon this letter that we heard, that happens to be, by the way, the shortest book in the whole Bible. It's 23 verses, not even chapters. So he writes this letter to Philemon, and he says, you know, friend, I'm sending Onesimus back to you, but not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. So, if you love me, you will treat him as you would treat me. Can you now see his problem? Can you see Philemon's problem now? Philemon, the slave owner, and Onesimus, the slave, they're now brothers in Christ. They worship the same God now. They receive the same Eucharist. And you know, Paul's point is that once Jesus comes to the equation, everything changes. Things cannot be the same. And if you take Jesus seriously, you will start treating people different. Starting with this slave of yours. So, you know, the whole economic structure of the ancient world was built on slavery. But here comes Jesus to mess things up. And because once a slave and a slave owner becomes a brothers in Christ, everything has to change because of that. You know, Paul said to Philemon, treat him as you would treat me. You know, it's easy to realize that for Philemon, life was easier before this troublemaking Jesus would come along with these ideas. It was easier to treat a slave as a slave was supposed to be treated. But now he has to treat a slave as a brother in Christ. And that is so challenging. You know, as I've been settling in 8 months, ever since I've been here at Clairemont, every time I drive around Clairemont, I see the other churches or other neighboring churches. And you know, some of them I've noticed have some fancy signs out there at the outside of their churches, or nice electronic screens. And you know, every once in a while I get to see some messages that they share there. A couple of them that I've seen recently was, one had, do you have questions? Jesus has answers. Or another one said, do you have struggles? Jesus gives strength. But you know, it seems like we're in the impression here that with those messages, Jesus has come to fix our problems, to make our life easier. You know, but along comes Jesus in today's gospel, and he says, and I quote, if you want to follow me, you have to hate your parents. You have to hate your brothers and sisters. You have to hate your spouse and children. You have to hate life. Oh, and by the way, you have to give away your possessions. And you all say, after that, praise to you, O Christ. You know? So, I would invite you to imagine, what if tomorrow, somehow, we would get $30,000 and fix our screen board out there, and next time you would come to church, you would find on that new street board a message that said, you know, if you want to become a Clairemont Lutheran member, You have to hate your parents. You have to hate your family, hate your life. Oh, and by the way, you have to give us all of your possession. How would attendance look like? Now that's when Jesus says, when we hear this message, Jesus saying that we need to hate, I think that we have to be very mindful and careful here not to take Jesus out of context. Jesus is the same guy that loved his parents. We could see that throughout the Gospels. It was Jesus himself that even in the cross, he would be thinking and looking for her mom. He loved his parents. So, that makes me think that maybe there might be a slight translation issue here. The Greek word used for hate in today's gospel reading, it's misi, which doesn't necessarily talk about when you love something, you hate everything else. It is not referred to love this and hate that. It is not an either or. But it is all about setting priorities. When you love first, what is it that you love first or best? And then all the other love flows from that. That is kind of like the sense that the word misi has to do with this in today's gospel. And the message that we hear from Jesus is we have to love God first over everything else. We have to love him first, and then every other love will flow from that. God, Jesus, has to be our priority over anything else. And then our love for Jesus has to shape the way we treat and we love others and each other. That will change how we'll treat our parents. That will change how we treat our spouse and our children and our brothers and sisters in Christ. And that will also create conflict between us. Our love for Jesus will require us to change the way we treat our families, our neighbors, our enemies. That has to shape the way we love. So Jesus is creating new problems for us here. If you are coming to church hoping that Jesus will fix all of your problems, friends, you might be a little disappointed. Or you're probably not paying attention. Every week, every time we gather here together, the gospel should be creating new problems for us. The gospel has to put us in a position of uncomfortableness. I would invite you, as an example, think on someone that every time gets on your last nerve. Think on someone that you just can't deal with. And please don't look around or point to someone. Just think about it. If you're not a Christian, if you wouldn't be a Christian, it would be so easy just to ignore them. Just to fight against them. But Jesus creates for us a big problem. Jesus tells us that person is your brother in Christ. And because he's your brother in Christ or sister in Christ, you have to treat them as you would have treated me, Jesus. So, Jesus wants us to have problems. Jesus wants us to have problems when we spread gossip against others or each other. Jesus wants us to be troubled when we hold old grudges against those who we don't like or we don't agree with. Jesus wants us to be troubled when we choose hatred instead of love, when we choose love, division instead of unity, when we choose resentment instead of forgiveness. You know, in treating all those who don't agree with me as I would treat him, that's a big problem, right? Or is it an easy thing? If we take Jesus seriously, his gospel will create new problems for us every week. If we listen. And you know, it will also create new opportunities as well. It will create opportunities for us to be strengthened to do his work. You know, for me, every time I'm gathered here with you around the table, that is a great opportunity for me to find that strength and to keep myself faithful and hopeful. Every time we are gathered as a community of faith, as brothers and sisters in Christ, that inspires me to do the good work, to do the good fight. Every time that we're nourished with his body and blood, and we realize that that's the Christ we have to love first and love most. Friends, be troubled by the gospel of Christ. Be nourished by his body and blood. Be faithful to do the good work and the good fight. Thanks be to God.